You're listening to Forecast, the marketing podcast for professional services leaders. If you're looking to generate more leads, win more deals, and take your firm to the next level, this show is your shortcut. Hey there, folks. Welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Ahmed Munawar. Happy New Year. This is our first episode of the new year, so I want to take a moment to wish you a happy new year. I hope you had a relaxing holiday, and I hope you've hit January firing on all cylinders and ready to go. And I wish you a tremendous, prosperous, and profitable 2018. With that, today's guest is Philip Ideson. Philip is a procurement executive. He's a consulting firm owner, and he's the host of a very popular podcast called The Art of Procurement. I asked Philip to come on the show today to talk about his transition from the corporate procurement executive life to starting his own procurement firm called Palambridge. But what's really interesting about Philip's story is how he started his firm. Before he'd really nailed down the business idea, Philip began with a podcast. He launched a podcast and went out and started interviewing his fellow procurement executives. And over time, he built an audience, but more importantly, he built relationships with key decision makers, which he then used when it was time to launch his consulting offering. So there's a lot to learn here from Philip and Philip's story, not only about transitioning from the executive life to starting a consulting firm, but also how to use a podcast to trigger new relationships with your ideal clients. Show notes to this episode are at forecast.fm/Ideson. That's forecast.fm/IDESON. Before I let you go, if you haven't yet joined us inside our free course on the 5 Ps of lead generation for professional service firms, you're going to want to check that out. Inside the course, I will walk you through a step-by-step process that you can use to generate a flood of new business for your firm. The course is 100% free of charge, and you can get immediate access at 5leadgen.com. You can spell out 5 or use the number. Either one works. That's 5leadgen.com. Last thing, if you like the show, if you like what you hear, do me a favor. Go to your favorite podcast player, type in Forecast Marketing, subscribe there. While you're at it, leave us a rating and a review because it helps more people discover the show. With that, here is Philip Ideson. Phil, thanks so much for coming on the show.
You're welcome, Ahmad. It's a pleasure for me to be joining you today.
Listen, why don't you get us started by telling us a bit about your professional background?
Yeah, so my background is in the profession of procurement, for better or worse, something that I really came into from university. I had no idea what procurement was when I started, honestly. I joined a rotation program for a Ford Motor Company, and they just said, hey, why don't you take this position in procurement and we'll rotate you out? And I enjoyed it so much that I ended up staying. And I think that's actually a typical case for procurement people that I come into contact with. They don't necessarily knowingly join the profession, but then they really enjoy kind of the scope that it brings, and we end up staying there.
And where did your career take you as a procurement professional?
Yeah, it was, so I joined Ford. I was buying direct material. So what that is essentially things that go into vehicles themselves. Left the direct side to go into what we call indirect procurement within the procurement space. So that's when you're buying things like corporate travel. I bought childcare services, really any service that helps a business operate. And in doing so, allowed me to work with large companies in automotive, with pharmaceutical, consumer products, tech, financial services. I basically worked in a variety of different roles, which took me up to the head of procurement role, so head of departments. Doing so, I did that in the UK, I did it in the US, and actually spent some time as well working out in India. So it just gave me such a kind of opportunity to work internationally and to work across a number of really interesting different companies. And it got to a point where, I was really interested I'd had all this experiences on the practitioner side. I was interested to go and look at being a service provider. So I moved over onto the service provider side and started providing procurement services and delivering procurement services within the outsourcing space to a variety of different clients for a couple of companies that are, pretty well-known companies. But I wanted to get that both sides of the table perspective.
So I find the story of making the leap from, corporate professional, executive in your case, to service provider, entrepreneur, independent consultant, whatever it may be, that's usually a pretty good story. Tell me a little bit about what that transition was like.
It was difficult. I'd been on the service provider side for a little while, and I'd always harbored ambitions and dreams of being in entrepreneurship, of running my own company right from when I started at my first job, and probably beforehand when I was at school. But I always saw that it was something that was too much risk. So I always waited and waited and waited, thinking there'll be a time when there's a little bit less risk out in the future. Maybe I've built up a little bit of a runway in terms of cash. And, it got to the point where I realized that I can keep waiting for the rest of my life, and the right time will probably never appear. By this point, we had 2 small kids. We'd moved out to Southern California. It's not cheap out here. But I just thought, I got to do this. I got to give it a go and start my own business. And so that's what I did. And it was scary, intimidating. I think it still is. It's not something that goes away. Definitely a roller coaster, however cliched that may be. But I probably never enjoyed myself as much as I enjoy doing what I'm doing right now.
Do you remember the moment, or was there a particular moment when you realized that, I have to do this now, I can't wait anymore?
I think that there's probably a couple of Thanksgiving dinners, or around Thanksgiving, we had family members who came out to Southern California. The majority of our family are either in the UK or in Detroit in Michigan. And they came out, and I remember really vividly sitting around the table talking about, how's work going? What have you been doing? And from one year to the next, I had the same perspective. I wasn't particularly enjoying what I was doing by the end, but I was still kind of talking about the same problems. And it just made me realize, what? If I don't do anything about it, I'm going to be talking about the same problems the year after, and the year after, and the year after. And it was just hearing myself realize that I got to get up and do something. That was kind of the impetus to start thinking and put in place the chain of events, which then occurred that allowed me, or made that final decision, that final call to go and do something different.
Yeah, it's funny. I think that's probably a pretty common scenario is those moments of realization at on family holidays.
Right.
When you're surrounded by your loved ones and you don't really want to be there, and the mind tends to wander, right?
I know. It was like I can't continue to keep sounding like a broken record if I want to go and do something about it. So, hey, let's go and do something about it.
So tell me about the early days of when you kind of made that transition. And just for the sake of context, how long ago was this?
It's coming up on 2 years. So I think of it. So I basically handed in my notice in April of 2015, and I actually worked an extended handover period. So I was really on my own from September of 2015. So coming on a couple of years when we record. I think when this goes out, be 2+ years.
Okay. And what were those early days like? And what did you do immediately to kind of go out and drum up business?
I don't think I did anything. Maybe that was part of my problem. I found it difficult to do anything in advance of going out on my own. Once I went out on my own, I think that I, started blogging, started reaching out to folks who I knew who I'd worked with in the past. But I wasn't overly aggressive in selling. Honestly, I hadn't really figured out what I wanted to be, only that I'd built a website, and it was around helping companies in a particular niche, because I thought I needed to be niche rather than just say, hey, I can help everybody with procurement however they may need it. So it was around the niche of procurement outsourcing. But I think I was following more build it and they will come. One of those, I think, cardinal sins and mistakes that new entrepreneurs make, and that by putting something out there and by talking about it would automatically mean people would find me.
And what was your kind of intelligent guess on the niche?
So the niche was, I knew that procurement outsourcing was an area that more and more organizations were interested in. It's an area that I had some very specific expertise in. I bought procurement outsourcing services. I've delivered procurement outsourcing services, and I've actually part of the role when I was in India was managing operation centers related to it. So it's something that I had a really broad and pretty unique perspective on. So I thought if there's any niche, then that's probably the niche where I want to start. But I didn't really give it a great deal of consideration in terms of how am I actually going to turn that into clients? And I think I was a little naive when I started in terms of how that would happen.
Well, I mean, it sounds like your thought process in choosing the niche was perfectly reasonable. So then you started blogging and you built a website, and that was all revolved around that one particular topic?
Yeah. Yes, pretty much. It was my experiences, my guidance. I'd actually built a couple of productized services within that niche as well. But what I wasn't as great at, I think, is just getting the message out and actually finding people who were having those problems that they needed help with.
So what happened in the end with that niche and that service offering?
So I actually, around that time, set up a podcast and started getting so much traction with the podcast that I stopped aggressively kind of pushing that niche that I'd built and the business that I'd set out to build, and started focusing on the pod itself and thinking, can I make the podcast into a business? Is this where the future lies? Because I'd suddenly found something that had a demand in terms of a listenership. I started to build a community of folks who knew, liked, and trusted me. So then my outlook changed to trying to sell something that I thought was a good idea to building a community of people and understanding what their challenges were, and then trying to build something that met their challenges. So I kind of transitioned from being that niche procurement outsourcing consultant to, okay, I have a little bit of runway here. Let's build this podcast and let's see who the people are that are attracted to that.
Okay, so let's definitely dive a lot deeper into that. But before we do, why don't you give us a little bit of context on the name of the podcast and the topic that you cover?
So it'll be no surprise, it's a procurement podcast. The name of the podcast is Art of Procurement. I started it about, it was November of 2015. So it'll be coming soon on a couple of years. And honestly, I started it because when I was making the decision to go on my own, podcasts were a big part of that kind of decision-making factor of what I listened to from people in the marketing, business development, kind of inspiration perspective. And I looked for procurement, and there was just nothing in procurement. And so I just thought maybe there's an opportunity here to start a procurement podcast because there's nothing that already exists. And the worst that can happen is that I get to interview a bunch of people who I look up to, and I have a platform to do so. So it gives me an excuse to make some really great contacts. And if anybody else listens, then, that's a bonus.
So I'm curious, what's some of the stuff that you were listening to when you decided to make the leap?
Yeah, I think that I'm trying to go back to those days. Tropical MBA was definitely one that I would listen to every week. The podcasts by, and it's funny, how you kind of move on. Amy Porterfield has one about online business, marketing. Chris, and I'm trying to think of what his surname is because I haven't listened to it in a little while. You know what? I'll have to let you know so you can put them in any show notes. But they were more general kind of business and building online communities and building your own podcast. Pat Flynn, I think, was one of them. So a lot of the usual suspects, but it made me realize, it kind of enlightened that fire that I had to act on what had always been a passion, but it was something that maybe I didn't feel as though I had the confidence to go and do myself. And it was just having those in my ear convinced me that why can't I try and do this?
Yeah, I mean, those are some inspirational folks to listen to. So I'm not surprised at all by that. When you went into the podcast and you started building this out, it sounds like the idea was that the podcast in and of itself would become the new business model. Is that what you thought?
I think so as the podcast became more popular, then that's where my thinking evolved to. That wasn't what I thought when I started, but I started realizing, what a great medium this was to connect with people. I started seeing the value that I was creating and the listenership that I was getting, which was pretty high for a small procurement niche. And when I say pretty high, it's not like you're talking tens of thousands of listeners, but when I think of the number of people that go to a procurement conference, that a lot of people pay a lot of money to get in front of those listeners, then, it was some big numbers. So I started to think that there was an opportunity here to actually build the podcast into a business of itself, whether it's some kind of media company related to it, whether it's learning and development programs that would spin off some of the content that was created in the podcasts, courses, the typical kind of online model, I guess. And so I did spend probably too long trying to figure out that, is this a business or is this part of a funnel? And I think there was a period of time when I really stopped focusing on the procurement consulting side, and saw this as an opportunity to build out a business around the art of procurement itself.
Okay, so tell me a little bit more about how you came to the conclusion that you drew as to whether or not this is a business of itself or part of the funnel. What were the kind of milestones along that journey?
Yeah, I think that some of it was, trying to actually go and do the selling of advertising space, advertising inventory that I'd created, but also some brand extensions that I looked at the time. I found that I was spending more time in trying to sell than I was continuing to invest in building a better product. And so that said to me that not that this didn't have the potential, because I still really think that it does have the potential. And actually, I've had clients, that I found because of the podcast, but that perhaps it needed a little bit more scale before it was really ready in terms of listenership, before it was really ready to try and take that next leap.
And is that kind of where things stand right now in terms of your thinking?
I think so. At the moment, as we've probably doubled, maybe a little bit more from that point in time. So I definitely continue to see opportunity to do a lot with the podcast and the content and, the brand that it's building and the community that's coming around it. So I think I'm in a stronger position to do that. Whether I do that or not, I'm not sure, because I think it's something that I probably need some help in doing it rather than being able to do it all on my own. But I think that as time evolves, the business case to be able to do that with the art of procurement, continues to increase.
So I know you mentioned that you pursued at some level advertising sponsorships.
Yes.
Was there any other, monetization strategies that you pursued for the podcast?
Yeah, I think, and things that I've looked at doing around hosting webinars, for example. So my vertical webinars are big, and they're sponsors, it's attractive to potential sponsors of webinars or participants in webinars to obviously get in front of different audiences. So there's monetization that's available through that. And not in the traditional sense where you think of online marketing, where it's all, a lot of it is referral and commission based, but actually in sponsors paying to be a part of that webinar up front. So there's opportunities there. There's opportunities in learning and development. So I think about the show that I put together. I think this is right for most podcasts. It's a series of dots. You listen to each episode in isolation of each other, and you often forget some of the content that was shared, or a lot of the content that was shared, because when you're listening, you're often driving or you're working out or whatever it may be. You haven't got a readily available way to really hold on to some of the great ideas you heard. And so I think there's an opportunity to pull all those dots together into something which is more meaningful behind some membership or subscription program that also offers some learning programs or courses that are built around some of that content. And I still really think that there's a big opportunity there. It's actually just something that I haven't jumped on yet.
Well, in the meantime, you've now kind of pivoted in terms of you've refocused on the service offering. And I know the service offering now has a new face. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, and so one of the things that I realized, I said before about getting to know who the audience is, I was really surprised with how senior demographic listen to the podcast, because people in the procurement community recognized that this was a really good way for them to learn to validate new ways and strategies that they could be approaching perhaps what were all similar challenges. And they just hadn't had the opportunity to really hear this kind of content on a consistent basis. So I had a lot of senior level listeners. When I go back to my past as in procurement outsourcing, which I talked about at the beginning, I've always observed what I thought were opportunities to improve upon the accessibility of the expertise that you ultimately end up buying when you're buying outsourced services. And when you think of outsourcing in this context, it's not really business process, which is more tactical or transactional. It's knowledge-based outsourcing or knowledge process outsourcing. So it's expertise that you're essentially buying in. So I've long had a vision of what a different kind of delivery model could look like in that space. Honestly, back 6-7 years, but never really had the ability, I don't think, to pull it off. One, because I don't think organizations were ready for something new in that space. But two, I didn't have the network to be able to pull it off. And so when I reflected on what I'd been able to build at the Art of Procurement, I saw I built a really great network. I've got a really great ecosystem of subject matter expertise that lives within a variety of different companies that now knows me through the podcast. I think we're at a time when organizations are more open to this idea of accessing expertise on a platform, kind of the Airbnb or the Uber model, but for subject matter expertise. So the market was more ready. And through the pod as well, I had a number of people that I'd interviewed that I'd been able to talk off mic about some of their challenges. So it just felt like all these different kind of factors coming together meant that this is probably a really good way of turning the podcast into, a real business, but a business that isn't necessarily directly related to the podcast in and of itself.
I mean, it sounds to me like what you've done, and I want you to correct me if I'm understanding this properly or not, but I think what you've done is you've created almost a medium through which your industry can communicate. Mm-hmm. So on the one hand, you're talking to procurement leaders. I know you've got some big guests on your shows, CPOs, heads of procurement, director of procurements at some pretty large companies, and you're getting their insights. You're also getting a sense of what their challenges are through the show, which is priceless data, right? But then you're also interviewing consultants and service providers that many of those procurement executives can benefit from, and you're kind of creating this conversation, and you're the man in the middle making it all happen, and you're getting a lot of the authority and the credibility that comes with that.
Yes, that's absolutely. One of the interesting things from some of the calls when I've been validating the model in the past that comes up a lot is trust. So there's now this trust from listeners who have heard me talk a lot about, what I'm trying to do is elevate the role of the profession, increase our impact. I'm providing value in terms of some of these conversations, and I'm not asking for money in return. So that builds up a trust in and of itself, while then applying that to both sides of the equation, essentially the CPOs on one side, but also the ecosystem on the other side. And I think it puts you in a really interesting position to connect them both, and then layer on top of that my experience within procurement outsourcing means I'm able to do that in a way that, as the person in the middle, I can actually guarantee the performance of the ecosystem because I understand, how to actually manage this ecosystem behind the scenes. So it's those three different parts all coming together, which essentially form the Palambridge business, which we launched a couple of months ago.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really fascinating why and how you settled on that business model, because a podcast could, what you're doing could conceivably fit into many different business models. But I think that the combination of, that network effect that you've created through the podcast, and now this networked business model, it creates a lot of synergy and a lot of opportunities for you. So I think that's fascinating. I want to hear a little bit more about how you launched Palambridge through the podcast. And I know that you're still kind of, you're still going through the motions with that. And we've been talking about that back and forth, but I'd love to kind of dive in as much as you're willing to share, how you've leveraged the podcast to build this new business model. Yeah,
I think when I launched the business, at its purest form, I did a podcast on the business. So that was just a way of immediately at least getting the name recognition and kind of the model in front of my listeners. Really what I wanted to do before we were even really ready to hit go on being able to support clients was we wanted to get the idea of the concept and the brand in front of people, because it is a little bit different. So I wanted to socialize that first. So that was one of the things, just using the pod as a vehicle to tell the story. And that's something that I continue to look at, in terms of some special editions or some bonus content or whatever, to take listeners of the podcast on the journey of what it's like to actually build a startup in the procurement community. Because I think that's something that's really interesting, that, helps connect listeners with what I'm doing, but also just it piques my interest as a listener. I think in procurement, we're interested in business generally. So it just seems like an interesting kind of synergy from a topic perspective. But then, there's the relationships that I'm able to make on the podcast. So, talking about the business model, doing development interviews with folks who have been guests of the show. So I can start talking about the challenges that I see and understanding them from their perspective. Am I on cloud nine in terms of what I think these challenges are, these problems are, or can chief procurement officers actually relate to them? That's been so helpful, talking through what we're trying to do, the way we're trying to do it, asking for people what they believe are our risks, our opportunities around that. Why wouldn't they buy? Why would they buy? That's kind of priceless information, and it just informs what we do as we go to market. And really, I wouldn't have been able to do that without being able to build these relationships with some with CPOs that I really look up to that have been onto the show, because we have that kind of personal connection.
Yeah, and I think that's so powerful, right? Ideally, you would have had a really strong business model that you were monetizing from day one, which would have been nice, I'm sure, right? But this really sets you up for success, because you've now invested so much in these relationships, and we all know the power of reciprocity is a really incredible thing, right?
Yeah.
You've offered value, you've engaged them in a conversation, they know you, so now when it comes to have a conversation about a product or a solution, it doesn't feel like a sales conversation. It doesn't feel like I'm being pitched to. It feels like Phil, my friend, my colleague, someone that a peer who I respect is coming for a conversation. I'm going to take the call.
Yeah, and that's how I want to position those conversations too, because, with all the best will in the world, the solution isn't for everybody. That may not be the right time for somebody. There's a whole confluence of other factors way out of my control that dictate whether somebody's ready for a solution like this or not. So I go into those conversations not thinking, I hope that I can sell something, but thinking, I'm going to get some really great insights out of this that are really going to help me in my positioning and identifying products to build. And if it ends up being a great fit or interest in terms of how we can help that person, then that's a bonus.
And you know what? The truth is, my sincere hope is that everything does work out really well with Palambridge, beyond your wildest dreams. But the truth is, even if it doesn't, you still have all those relationships, and those are worth their weight in gold.
Yeah, and that's how I've looked at the investment. It's taken me a little bit of it's a non-linear journey to get from where I started to get to here, all building on each other and kind of taking some turns in the road along the way. When I look back at the cost and the opportunity cost of doing that, there's obviously it's not being cheap, but I've really seen this as investing in the relationships more than anything, because those relationships, they're worth so much. And if today I have a product that I really hope that it does resonate with the market, and the conversations we've been having have been positive, but you can never really take those relationships away so long as you nurture them and be respectful.
And just think about how much harder it would have been if you didn't have those relationships. You probably still would have had the same idea for Palambridge. I know it's something that's been kind of, brewing in your mind for a while, but getting those conversations would have been infinitely harder if you didn't have the credibility shield of the podcast.
Oh, absolutely. It's been absolutely, the number one reason why I'm able to have some of the great conversations I've been having is because of the podcast, either because I've got to know personally people that I'm having these conversations with, or they have got to know me through the podcast. And, perhaps they've reached out to me over time for some advice based on a podcast, and I've just helped them with a couple of line email. That just builds so much, again, trust and credibility that you're helping. You're not doing something that is just for the purpose of money, that I would never have been able to do if I was, a random person, reaching out with a cold email. I could never really even start to think about how I would build this from the ground up if I was in that position.
Yeah, I think it's just fascinating. And I love, the reason why I was so excited about this interview, Phil, as we were talking offline is, I love this idea of podcast turned business.
Right.
There aren't many people doing this yet. And that's partially why you've been so successful, is because you were kind of early to the game. But I think you're reaping the benefits. I would really love to have you on the show, probably, sometime next year, to hear about all the huge deals you've been closing in the meantime.
I'll keep my fingers crossed.
Yeah. Well, I think you're definitely on your way from what I can tell. So Phil, it's been a real pleasure. Tell folks where they can find you or look you up if they want to connect with you online.
Yeah, so the easiest way is via LinkedIn. So if you just go on LinkedIn, pop in my name there, I'll be sure to connect with you. Send me a note, happy to connect that way. The business, well, let me talk about the podcast. The podcast is at artofprocurement.com, and the business is Palambridge.com. But for anybody who's actually in the audience who has some connection with procurement, not sure how many folks that will be, feel free to check out those. But otherwise, you find me on LinkedIn. I'm always happy to hear from listeners.
Great. And we're going to put all those links into the show notes of this episode.
Perfect.
Phil, thanks so much. This has been great.
No, my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Ahmad.
Hey, it's Ahmed here again. Before I let you go, there are two things I want you to do. The first is, if you like what you hear, go ahead and subscribe to the show on iTunes or Google Play by visiting forecast.fm and clicking on the relevant link. While you're at it, please do leave us a rating or a review, because it helps more people discover the show. The second thing is, I want you to grab my free course on the 5 Ps of lead generation for professional services firms. Inside the course, you will get a step-by-step framework to help you generate a flood of new business for your firm. The course is 100% free of charge, and you can get immediate access at 5leadgen.com, and you can spell out 5 or use the number. Either one works. That's 5leadgen.com. Thanks for listening.